Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to another event, a Thursday open classroom here in our public course, Video Art and Context. My name is Shannon Jackson, and on behalf of my co-teachers, Greg Niemeyer, Sachi Mulkey, and Zihan Liu, it's a pleasure to welcome you here. We, as many of you know, we teach a course throughout the week on the history, the aesthetics, and politics of video art as a form. And we open it every Thursday to a network of speakers. The capacity to do so is made possible thanks to a very generous donation from the Kramlich Art Foundation, the capacity to host us as teachers, host this venue, have the speakers we do. And in so doing, we're advancing the Kramlich Art Foundation's commitments and interests in the mission of education, research, and public engagement in the field of video and media art. Our capacity to do so here is also made possible thanks to the incredible BAMPFA staff, those who organize the venue, those who are in the booth orchestrating our tech. So before I proceed further, I hope you can help me thank the Kramlich Art Foundation and BAMPFA for their collaboration. We've been privileged, actually, thus far, to welcome a network of incredibly exciting speakers, including William Kentridge, Jeffrey Gibson, Nick Kay, and we have ahead Danielle Dean, Rudolph Friedling, before my co-teacher and I, Greg Niemeyer, close out our show in late April. But today I have the enormous privilege of welcoming and introducing not only one, but two luminaries in our exploration of video and media art. First off, our featured speaker for today, and one of the Bay Area's own historic leaders in this field, Lynn Hershman Leeson. Over the last 5 decades, artist and filmmaker Lynn Hershman Leeson has received international acclaim for explorations of art and technology, and is now widely recognized as having produced a body of work that represents and actually arguably anticipates nearly every technological, aesthetic, and social turn one can imagine in teaching the field of media art. She's a teacher's dream in that way. She's made pioneering contributions to the field of photography, video, film, performance, artificial intelligence, bioart, installation, and interactive art and net-based art. We absolutely don't have time to recount all of Lynn's major exhibitions, her 6 feature films, all of her awards and honors, but I'll just note a few here, including her comprehensive career retrospective at ZKM in Karlsruhe, along with its catalog, Civic Radar, an incredible publication. Her awards include the SIGGRAPH Lifetime Achievement Award, the Prix Ars Electronica Award, the USA Artist Fellowship, the College Art Association's Lifetime Achievement Award, Creative Capital's Distinguished Art Award, and fairly recently, a special mention for her contribution to the 2022 Venice Biennale, which we'll get to experience today. Lynn's work is held in the collections of major museums and private collections throughout the world, including MoMA, SF MoMA, Tate Modern, and she also recently had a retrospective at the New Museum. Lynn, it was entitled Lynn Hershman Leeson Twisted. Indeed, on that occasion of that exhibition, Lynn engaged in a provocative dialogue with then New Museum curator Margot Norton, who incidentally is about to be our incoming curator here at BAMPFA. When asking Lynn about Roberta Brightmore, the fictional persona that Lynn adopted and transformed throughout a variety of sites and artworks and technological platforms, Margot suggested to Lynn that she was a predecessor for artificial intelligence, quote, one who would go out into the world and learn how to interact, her own kind of intelligent machine. Lynn agreed, saying, yeah, and she also created an archive of 50 plus years later that 50 plus years later can be looked through. So in a sense, it is as if she's re-performing when you look through what she's done. Along the way, she was culling information from stereotypical representations of the way women are supposed to look and how they were supposed to behave. And Roberta learned that kind of data and information in order to comport herself. That's me. In making this robust analogy between the earliest and latest iterations of Roberta and artificial intelligence, we might also note that Lynn is offering a cautionary tale about the risks and biases of AI, showing how such aggregations of so-called information can actually reproduce bad information, something to share in the age of ChatGPT, and that in consolidating we'll say shaky information, it consolidates and reinforces, in this case, unequal constraints of gender stereotyping and inequity. It is a thrill, then, to welcome today Lynn so that we can engage differently in this 50-year archive of work, as well as to learn about the next social and technological turn I know she's probably anticipating now. Before we welcome Lynn to start us off, I also want to introduce and thank Claudia Schmuckli for joining us today as a respondent. Claudia is currently the curator in charge of contemporary art and programming, the inaugural curator holding that title, for the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco and De Young Legion of Honor. Since joining the museums in 2016, Claudia has developed exhibitions and commissions with an array of incredibly exciting artists: Sarah Lucas, Urs Fischer, Lynn Hershman Leeson, Leonardo Drew, DIS, Reino Mukherjee, and acquired works by the Propeller Group, Carrie Mae Weems, Tony Fair, Jessica Stockholder, Terry Atkins, and more. No? And Lynn, okay, and Lynn. One of her signature exhibitions thus far included Uncanny Valley, Being Human in the Age of AI, which had the notable distinction of opening in March 2020. Previously, she was director and chief curator of the Blaffer Art Museum at the University of Houston, where she organized over 30 exhibitions. Schmuckli actually began her career as a curatorial assistant at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and as an assistant curator at the Museum of Modern Art. She holds a master's degree in art history from LMU in Munich, Germany, and she is a bridge builder, rainmaker here in the Bay Area that makes us all so happy to have her in the region. So, first off, and without further ado, help me welcome Lynn Hershman Leeson.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction that you gave. And it's really a pleasure to be here with Shannon and Claudia and all of you who came to it. What I'm going to do is I've been given 20 minutes to zip through about 60 years of work. So I'll start zipping really fast. Yeah. So this is work, as you see, I was doing in the early 60s. One is called Self-Portrait as Another Person. The other is A Breathing Machine. And I had been put into the hospital for over a year and years after recovering because, and all I could hear when I was under an oxygen tent was my breath. So when I finally was able to do work again, I would use the idea of sound, which to me was like a drawing because it would draw people into the piece itself or what it was looking at. And so these pieces were made with sensors and sound, and you'd walk in up to it and they would really perform interactively with you. So I'd like to say that the most important things of my life were made on the cusp and because of the cusp of disasters and presumed failures. And so I showed these nearby at the University Art Museum. I was supposed to have a drawing show, but I thought these were drawings. And immediately, within 24 hours, they closed down the show with no explanation about why that happened. And they said that sound was media and media wasn't art, and they couldn't show it. And that's something that had trailed me for about 45 years. These works were finally shown in 2014 for the first time, many of them. So at the time, women weren't shown in galleries, much less museums. And one of the things I did was I created 3 critics, Prudence Juris, Gay Bannon, and Herbert Good. Each one of them wrote in a different style and a different kind of paper, from throwaways that would land on your doorstep to Art Forum, Art International, and so forth. And they would also, besides writing about what was going on in the Bay Area, they would write about my work. And because it was so unheard of for a woman to have their work critiqued in that way, nobody knew that I was the one that was writing them. I was able to finally to get a gallery and to show my work. And you say, well, is that ethical or unethical to do that? But is it unethical to block people from showing their work based on some sort of irrelevant cultural prejudice? So after the work was excluded and booted out of the museum, I thought, well, who needs a museum? And what I did with my friend Eleanor Coppola was to rent a room in a hotel called the Dante Hotel, appropriately in North Beach. I think it was $10 a week. And I put the piece there. And in this room, I put the artifacts of somebody who might have lived there. So the people go there 24 hours a day, sign in, get a key. This before site-specific was known as a form of art. And they could trespass into this alien space. And the piece lasted for nearly a year until somebody reported it to the police, where they came in and took everything to central headquarters, which I thought was an apt ending to that show. And when I was in the room thinking about how to articulate a fictional person, I started to think, well, what if you had a fictional person that would go out into reality and interact with reality, even with the articles of reality, but who herself wasn't real, but she would accumulate things that would kind of challenge what reality is. And that was the genesis of Roberta Brightmore, who started in 1972 and lasted nearly a decade. She ended with an exorcism in 1979. And she would, in Lucretia Borgia's crypt, and she would do things like put ads in the newspaper to meet people, to meet roommates, go out and meet people, have a psychiatric chart with a real psychiatrist. She was able to get credit cards, open a bank account, have a driver's license. At the time, I couldn't get credit. I had bad credit, so I couldn't get any more. But Roberta was a blank slate, and so she was able to collect this. And this is Roberta meeting one of the Mr. America people who answered her ad. And finally, after nearly a decade of all these negative experiences, all of which were documented and all of which you can go through now at Stanford and reenact, was her exorcism, because I wanted to change the tenor of Roberta's negativity into one of productivity and optimism for the future. So she lie in state, one of the multiples, because I couldn't keep up with all of the requirements of Roberta's life, so I had 3 multiples that went out as her, and one of them, Lion State, burnt her effigy and Lion State in the fog and smoke for 24 hours, just marking the conversion. Around that time, too, in the mid-'70s, I had 2 big projects. One was the associate project director of Christo's Running Fence, which was a 24-mile fence that took place near Petaluma in North America, as well as something called the Floating Museum, which the Floating Museum was dedicated to showing other artists that they didn't need to have a museum either, and it helped many artists, I think over 300, to put works outside of museum structures. So they were on stairs and doorways. People from Newton and Helen Harrison to Michael Asher, many people actually from around the world. And the first thing that happened with my work after the exorcism was a piece called Lorna. And Lorna is cited as the first interactive computer-based video disc. And this really was inspired by going up the steps to go to the Dante Hotel, because that became kind of like a flow chart. You could go up the steps, get a key, go into the room. And so I started to think about creating something that you could that would use that flow chart of the time. And since I live in the Bay Area, to use some of the technologies that were just being invented here, that were coming into reality. And in this, you would sit in a chair that was very much like Lorna's chair in a room that looked like hers, and used the remote switch to remotely see her life. And it had 3 endings, various soundtracks, and by just simply pressing your remote in different ways, you would get to understand who Lorna was and what her life was about. And Lorna was really afraid of everything. She was agoraphobic, which is why she didn't leave her apartment. It was very different from Roberta. After that came a piece called Deep Contact, where you just touched a screen. This was the first touch screen that was made, and you touched various parts of her body, and it would lead you into different adventures that you could follow, again, at different speeds and rates and soundtracks to get to know who the character was. America's Finest. In this piece, you look through the gun scope and pull the trigger, and by pulling the trigger, a surveillance camera puts you inside the gun scope, where you see the history of cameras that is merged with the history of warfare, and become complicit in both. So the person who pulls the trigger becomes a victim of their own action, which is what warfare does. This piece also, Room of One's Own, is one in which you look through kind of a periscope-like device and see your own eye, and where you look, different actions happen in the video and back of it. And then I was working with the idea of cyborgs and cyborgian identity and the merging of machines and looking inside of people. And one of the examples are these collages, because it was pre-Photoshop, in which women became victims of capture systems like cameras, which changes how they're looked at and how they look at themselves. The internet was being invented around then, and I created this double work with Cyber Roberta and Tilly. So it was Roberta, but her eyes are cameras. And you see here with that there's a digital camera in one eye, a quick cam on the other, and you could go on the internet and click her eyes, which I call icons, and they would convert what she's seeing to the internet and create a wider base of her exposure. And you could also telerobotically move her head 180 degrees, so she was also like a nanny cam at that time. A lot of these things seem really easy, but at that time nobody had heard of doing that, which is why they weren't shown. Cynthia Stock Ticker, and in this one, the character's behavior changed. There are 13 different behavior changes that depend on the market. So the market goes up, she starts shopping or dancing. If it goes down, she starts drinking, and so forth. And these are real-time effects. And I started to think about doing films also, because since nobody would show these works, I wanted to see if I could create an audience for them. And the first one I did was about Ada Lovelace, who wrote the first computer program, but nobody knew about her in those days. So I created this feature film. And of course, there was no budget to do it until the Swinton agreed to do it, and we didn't know how we were going to make the sets for it because there was no money. I had more nerve than money still, and so we created something called virtual sets, in which we shot on a blue screen, and simultaneous to shooting, we had gone to bed and breakfast places around town and gathered images that looked like they could have been made in the 18th century, and we were able to drop these in as the actors were actually doing the scenes. And we made it very quickly. I think we did it in 5 days. We shot this film. And then Technolust, which again was the first 24-frame high-definition film that came out, using Tilda again and 3 clones that she had that survived by a website that one of the clones had. And her name was Ruby, and I wanted to create a system that had expanded cinema that would go beyond the screen so that people could watch the movie, see the character, and leave the theater and talk to the character. And that was the genesis for the creation of Agent Ruby. And that it was a chatbot that we made in 1998. And what I did was find programmers on the internet. I think there were 18 from all over the world that worked together to create something that was very similar to AIML. And this piece was given to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where it lives today, and it's still the most visited artwork in their collection. And this was 12 years before Siri. And this is the same piece, but in this one, you could actually talk to Dina rather than just typing. I also started in the early 80s to just set up a camera in order to learn how to use a camera and shoot video and edit video and talk. And I found, lo and behold, I was saying things that my therapist never heard. And so I would shoot all year, and then in the summer look at what I shot and edit it. And that became something I call the electronic diaries that have gone until 2019, although they may start up again. And you can go to see this piece, which is either linear configuration or seen in a series like this. And you actually see aging, see the concerns change, hear the difficulties and how one overcomes time in order to come to some resolution of their future. There's an artist by the name of Steve Kurtz, and I was in a carpool where I heard that he was being arrested for bioterrorism because his wife had a heart attack, and the medics came and saw that there were petri dishes in his lab, and I thought this was really horrible because he was facing a 23-year prison sentence. So I wanted to let people know somehow that this was going on, and created this film called Strange Culture about Steve and his life, and what the ills of our culture was, and how this could happen and how it shouldn't happen. And the film actually was quite successful in the Berlin Film Festival and played all over. And in the New York Times, it was a perfect film. And because of that film, as Steve will say, the charges eventually were dropped. So I'm really proud that an artwork actually caused a real shift of somebody's life. Another one that did that was called War, Women Art Revolution. And this, in the 60s, I thought one of the most interesting things that was going on, and I was here in Berkeley as a graduate student, was not the free speech movement, but the women's movement. And I started to document people as they came to town, and eventually ended up with, I think, 2,500 hours of footage that started in '68 and went until 2011. And eventually I had to edit it. And it became this film that's really the only history that exists of that phenomenon of how women changed, what they did in order to change the culture and become present in the cultural landscape. And this is now still in distribution and in many major museum collections. And there's also an archive online at Stanford where you can go and hear the full interviews of all the participants. I think there were 65 artists that participated in this over time, where we'd shoot them at different ages. I started this project early. I'm skipping a lot of work. This is called the Infinity Engine. And I started to realize that the genome was programmed. And understanding that had massive implications for what it meant to life itself. So I started at that time to work on this and interview people and create what became this installation. that included things like a genetically modified cat, knowing about CRISPR, understanding what scientists were doing with bioprinting, and was kind of like cyborgian interest being reborn through time, and because we were at this time enabled to use the technology to understand and change ideas of what DNA in the genome actually did and how they could be manipulated. So this was, here you see a bioprinted nose. That was a long-term project that opened up in 2018 and still continues to have things added to it. When I exhibited this work, I did it first in Basel, and I wanted to work with some companies there that were existing, and Novartis was there, and I was put in touch with somebody on the museum board who was a scientist, and we decided to create an antibody for both Lynn Hershman and Roberta. And we did that. The Lynn Hershman antibody actually had no function whatsoever, but Roberta's didn't meld with anything, and Novartis said they hit the jackpot with this project because they're using this still in research because they'd been trying to create something that didn't merge with anything, and lo and behold, Roberta was the one that broke through. And I also was able to take all of the research that I had done to make the Infinity Engine, which is videotapes and information and files, and turn that into DNA itself. And this is something I learned from George Church, who was at Harvard, who had figured out how to do this in advance, and he helped me to do this. So I created something called Room Number 8, which is owned by the SF MoMA and was on exhibition recently, that shows both the antibody and the DNA conversion of how you take all of this enormous material as well as your own life and put it into this little vial that's invisible. It's kind of the metaphor for life itself. And since Roberta, I've been doing things called water women, which is a woman whose body is water drops, and it's really about transformation, transition, and time and evaporation. So it's birth and death, and I've been using these in different ways throughout time, but perhaps. The key to this is a piece called Twisted Gravity. I worked again with the same scientist at Novartis, and we thought, why can't we do something that takes that takes plastic out of water and purifies it? And Thomas was able to contact Harvard again, but a different place there, the Weiss Institute, and we actually were able to create a system that did purify water. And take bacteria from it and make it drinkable very quickly. So if there were earthquakes somewhere and no water, clear water available, they could use the system and in an hour have purified water. It's called Twisted Gravity, and this is what it looks like when it's installed with the water women. And I just want to read you something that they say. You say, well, how can you just go into companies and meet with scientists and engineers and do these things? This is something that the Weiss Institute put out in their paper. Working with Lynn opened our eyes to the counterpoint of water purification. We're using a plastic system to kill bacteria. And what happened to the plastic? The evolution concept came out of evolving bacteria to degrade plastics. The concept has spawned an entirely new research project at the Weiss Institute. Let's use bacteria to solve the human waste problem of plastic. And the collaboration didn't just create art, but it created a new version of science. So again, these are things that I'm really happy turned out in the way that they did and kind of expanded possibilities like they did for Steve. This is a piece that was in Claudia's show. I think actually the date is wrong. I think it was a year and a half earlier than this. The way this works is you need to put in your email as you enter the space, and from your email, all kinds of information immediately pops up inside the room that you enter. Whether it's where you had lunch or who your mother's friends are. And it has a video here with Tessa Thompson that talks about targeting unsuspecting people, generally people who are non-white and in lower income neighborhoods, and they become targets for arrest and targets to have their identity stolen. So the algorithms in this case become invisible and malicious without our knowing about it. And this is a piece that warns people to be careful about how their image is used and what they put online. And this piece is the one that you're going to see now, and it's called Logic Paralyzes the Heart. And it's really about the history of AI, and it's about a 61-year-old cyborg who's unhappy with her life because of what she's spawned by living through it. And it's an installation that has in it people who don't exist. These images are made of people completely with AI-generated images that in this case is wallpaper. That show kind of the mix of reality and scary reality of how human they look, but the fact that they don't exist could predate and presage the idea that maybe people won't exist eventually. The piece I'm doing right now, which I hope to have finished in about 6 weeks, is called Cyborgian Rhapsody, and it's written and performed by a chatbot who actually wrote the script. And I tried to keep myself out of it except to transcribe what she said and what it said, because it says it doesn't have a gender. And it looks like a version of myself some 30 years ago. It also sounds like me. So, and it talks about the problems with life right now. And the next project that I'm working on is really about immortality and about what makes something immortal. Many bacteria is immortal. Jellyfish, certain types are immortal. People are one scientist said that maybe jellyfish, maybe bacteria need humans for their host, and collective consciousness is bacteria that is telling us how to behave because they need us to behave in certain ways. I don't know, but a lot of the scientists that I worked with on the Infinity Engine are also working on this idea as well. So I think what we'll do is end this by showing the piece that was in Venice, and then having a discussion soon after.
Thank you so much, Lynn and Claudia, for joining us, and Lynn for collapsing so much creativity into those 20 minutes and giving a full. Some people who might know some of those works know how much she was leaving out and how many other things she wasn't able to cover, but I think it really did give a sense of how much issues around gender and feminism that propelled your work from the beginning have been also matching and responding to ever new technological platforms at every turn. Maybe just to start things off, and I know Claudia has a number of questions, and I want to ask her some as well. Just the invocation that you brought at the very beginning of inventing Roberta, or even before Roberta, inventing the critics who wrote about artwork. And I think we've been thinking also about early feminist media artists, early artists who were not accepted as art at the beginning. And sort of needing, in some ways, to create your own infrastructure in order to show your work and have it circulate. It was interesting I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that process, because here, even today, you said that some people might say, is this unethical that you're creating a persona, unethical that you're advertising, a venue that doesn't exist, quote unquote. And I think you had a great comeback, too, about what inequity it's actually rectifying. But I wonder if you could say more about that context, given that you only had about 30 seconds to say something about it today.
Yes, I want to reiterate that if I hadn't had my work taken out of the museum, none of this would have happened. So I think you have to treasure what's perceived as a failure at the time and figure out how it could be effective in the world. And sometimes the failures of a culture, like discrimination, is something that we could work around if we start to think about what could be done to change the perceptions and the ways that we can interact with all living things. So it's just a matter of not accepting a very limited view that culture often has.
Yeah, and I guess also to say that you might have initially received this as a, quote, personal failure. I wasn't accepted or I was withdrawn. But instead, what you're actually exposing is a systemic failure, and you're working at that level to rectify it. I wonder, I know there's a lot of students here also from different disciplines who have different points of entry into work like this, and I wonder if you can say just a little bit more when I introduced you, and you've also reinforced how many different sort of ever new or not quite new technologies you found yourself working in, or scientific collaborations that changed not only art but changed science. The sort of mindset that you're in at that time, how much is failure or mistakes or error or surprise or spontaneous choices whose effects you don't see? I wonder how intentional you are about how you're using technology versus how much you understand what you're doing after it's unfolds and realize what you've done.
I never realized what I've done or what it could do, but I figured that if you're alive and if you live in places like the Bay Area, things are really in the air, and if you think of them, then they're probably possible. And it's a matter of having the confidence to find a way to reject the idea of failure as being think of it only as part way to finding the solution of what one needs to do. And that's part of invention, which is what art is about. You start with any kind of a blank canvas, whether it's the idea of understanding the genome or whether it's doing a painting. And it's having really the confidence to find a way to conclude that and bring it to a different level than where you started from.
Right, which is what to show the kinship between the artist's mind and the scientist's mind, perhaps. You also, one last thing, people probably have to notice that you also get a lot of celebrity collaboration. Tilda Swinton, Tessa Thompson, very cutting edge curators, Joan Chen. And I know you can't necessarily pay these celebrity actors the fees that they usually receive. What do you think? Why do you think they want to work with you?
I think it's luck. And I think also, like when I started to work with Tilda, she had just finished Orlando. She was unknown, basically. And I think that most artists want to do something, and this goes for cinematographers and editors, all kinds of people that I work with. They just want to do something that's new and inventive that doesn't depend on the past, but where they could invent something that has their voice in it. And for instance, with Tessa Thompson, agreed to do this because she had seen Technolust, and on is that varying ways the connections are made that we don't intend when we do them, when we're just trying to invent ourselves.
Great, thank you. Claudia, you want to jump in?
I do want to jump in. You touched upon it, by saying by the mere fact that you lived in San Francisco, and of course, technology is in the air, that was part of the motivation to explore that realm. But I also wonder how much of your interest in engaging new technologies also had to do with the idea of prejudice and discrimination, because, I mean, to this day, right? I mean, up until in this very moment, all these new technologies are always met with a sense of fear on the part of a broader population. So I'm curious, at the very beginning, when you first started going in that direction, how much of that was also in your mind? I mean, to that, maybe the degree to which you felt you had been discriminated because you were a woman, like how an engagement with technology was also part of that issue that you wanted to force.
I was really surprised by the resistance, because I thought it was exciting to be able to use technology as it's being invented, but others didn't feel that way. I think people need a degree of comfort that may take 3 or 4 decades before something becomes real in their lives. But the idea is not to let that defeat you. And even though it took maybe close to 5 decades for the works to even be shown, I'm not alone. Namjoon Paik had similar, Apollinaire, they all had this history of their work not being accepted during the time that they're making it. But that's not why you make it. You make it to question the very culture that's resisting it. And in doing so, that creates the answer to it. So it's really to have faith that in time it will be understood and seen in the future history.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that really, infuses your work throughout is obviously a great curiosity about technology, an awareness of its origins in, the military complex, or you've talked about AI's complicity with warfare, and we all know that a lot of these technologies were developed for purposes that we are weary of. But there's obviously such a belief in the potentiality of technology to be put to better use, and I think that's even in this last piece that we just saw, logic paralyzes the heart. It comes through loud and clear, your passion for it. And so I'm curious to hear you talk about, especially at this particular juncture in time, where the conversations around ChatGPT and all this have such broad public reach in ways that, maybe other technologies in the past have not had in the very moment that they were created and put out in the world. This desire to educate, but also inspire, anticipate, how do you walk that line? It's a really complicated line to negotiate.
Well, when you think about it, what this has brought us to is a broad connectivity in varying ways on varying platforms, just at a time we really need it to survive, and to survive all the damage we've done to the planet. So I really trust in what we're inventing as means towards continuing towards continuing immortality, which means that we get to evolve in the future.
Yeah, and another thing that I think your work really posits as a possibility in ways that maybe is not so apparent to many people is how an artist's involvement with the technologists, the designers, the engineers, the scientists who develop these new technologies can really have an impact on how they're being deployed in the world and how they're being researched and applied. I mean, you mentioned 2 examples in your presentation, both developed with Novartis. And, I think that's something that we really need as a society, and that we need to be more aware of and more more sort of, wanting to put out there in the world is like how your vision as an artist can actually shape the technologies of the future. And I think you've done such you're set such an example for other people. How difficult was that process for you in terms of getting in to these conversations? Because I think a lot of young artists maybe who come, out of a degree program maybe don't know how to start these conversations. So can you give them advice?
Well, my advice to young people is to not throw anything away, and to keep your sense of humor. And, I think that the best scientists are really very much like artists, because they're searching for answers to questions that they have, and trying to find ways to manifest ideas in the world, which is what artists do. I generally have to prepare when I want to interview someone. Sometimes it takes years. With George Church, who's called the father of synthetic biology, took me 3.5 years. And you have to understand what these other people do and why they should talk to you, and be respectful from that. And I think that once scientists understand that you're serious and that you know what they're doing, it's not just a superficial venture, that they embrace the idea of working together to create something, using ideas that maybe people with their discipline hadn't thought of. So I think it's being confident, but yet also doing the research and being prepared and respectful of what they do.
Can I ask a question about your collaboration together, or ongoing collaboration? Which includes, of course, Claudia making sure that more of Lynn's work is in the collection with the De Young Fine Arts Museums, but also recently Claudia's extraordinary exhibition, Uncanny Valley, on the art of being human in the age of AI. And I wonder if we could, for those many of whom didn't get to see it, if you might say a little bit more, Claudia, about your aspirations in putting together that show and what it meant to include Lynn, not surprising, but what she offered. And maybe also for both of you, that show opening in 2020, needing to close, opening again. But of course, we learned a lot about the screen during COVID as well. And we're learning even more about the effect of technology on our lives. So I wonder also what you'd do differently now if you were to do that show, or what you'd add to it, or if you think people's experiences of that artwork might be different now.
Well, let me begin by saying that Lynn was one of my main thinking partners as I was conceiving the exhibition. We had worked together before. We did a project at the Legion of Honor, which was called Vertighost. And I think I maybe have told you at that time that I was percolating on the idea of doing that yet unnamed exhibition that became Uncanny Valley. And who better to really help me refine the ideas of what an exhibition on a subject that at the time was just AI, could look like. Because it was a moment where a lot of exhibitions on that topic, I think, were being conceived around the world, and I felt that many of them, for me, missed the mark because, and that is not to criticize the work of the artists who were in the show, but there was a lot of work that used the tool in illustrative ways, like how you fall in love with a technology and you create, which is what's happening with DALL-E and Midjourney right now, I think on a hugely expanded scale. But that I really wanted to do an exhibition that thought deeply about the philosophical and political stakes that we were dealing with as AI was introduced sort of like into the world, into the social fabric. And then also thinking about what is the visual language, you know, that artists are using to express that, and how do they actually draw on many of the ideas that inform the design, that describe the operations of algorithms and algorithmic systems. So that's how we started talking. And so you had already started thinking about Shadow Stalker at the time and wanted to develop the work. You hadn't done it yet, but as always, Lynn moves at warp speed. I think she said she made a film in 5 days during her presentation.
Shot it.
Shot it in 5 days.
2 years to edit.
Okay, all right. It's not quite that fast, but still. And so, you know, it was tackling one of the most important issues that really brought to the fore the conversation around bias in AI. And so it was always clear for me, at least, that that was going to be a key work in the show. And then, of course, we all talked about the artists that we admire that made work in that realm. And yeah, I don't know, Lynn, what do you want to say about your participation in the show?
Well, I want to say, you know, I don't know how many of you were fortunate enough to see that exhibition, but, you know, there were many and are many exhibitions around the world, and I was in most of them. And the show that Claudia did was really astounding. I think it's far exceeds what anybody else has done in the field. You know, it really understands AI, or what the wide span of information that it covers, and it was very careful to have a wide span of artists who are working in different facets that explore these things. So if you haven't seen the show, you can get the catalog still, and it was a wonderful show to have anywhere, but especially here where it should be.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Lynn. And the second part of your question was like, how would the thinking have changed? And well, it's interesting because I am thinking about a sequel. You know, it's not going to be called Uncanny Valley, but for, you know, working purposes, I'm calling it Uncanny Valley 2 just for now. And it is interesting to look at what has happened over the past 5 years. On the one hand, how the show has only sort of accrued in its timeliness and urgency in addressing how truly these algorithmic systems are shaping every aspect of our lives, and that in and of itself hasn't changed. So that is, of course, still part of the conversation. But then again, with, you know, so many developments over the last 8 to 10 months, we are also looking at a different set of questions and how that have everything to do with acceleration, you know, acceleration of, you know, how labor, how work in the creative field is going to look like a few years now. Acceleration of what and how we think about life a few years now. You know, Lynn's latest project, the Cyborgian Rhapsody, which of course we haven't seen yet, but that she briefly mentioned, taps into one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, sort of in view of what a next iteration of a show that deals with, you know, with AI could be, because it touches upon this intersection of AI and art and life, and, you know, and artificial life, and how does the conception of life change, you know, when we suddenly have technologies available that allow us to intersect at the cellular level. And maybe you want to talk a little more about that, Lynn, because you're really in the thick of it right now.
Well, it also can't tell reality from fiction, and it makes lots of mistakes and needs humans to interpret what it's saying. So really, you know, like it's learning to dream, but I mean, it needs. it needs collaboration. It can't exist on its own. What people are so afraid of, they've always been afraid of anything new, particularly technology or just anything at all. But it really, and it's evolving, and it's becoming. Not obsolete, but part of a historical ecology. My cyborg at the end says that it looks forward to the future, but it won't see that future because it's being replaced by something that's smarter and better. And so one has to understand that they're just part of an ongoing search for meaning and possibilities of life itself, which we continue to invent.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you. I wonder if we could turn out to the audience and see if there's any responses or questions, comments, connections. And if you do have one, maybe everybody who has one brewing, could you raise your hands and then ushers can find you and we'll get you in a series here in the blue sleeve. We'll start there, and then if you could get, I think there was somebody up there, is that right? We'll go after, yeah.
Hi there, yeah. So I saw the exhibition that was at Yerba Buena Center a few years back that was totally mind-blowing and amazing. One question I had was, do you hold any patents? Because it seems like some of the things you've done could have been patented, potentially.
I do. It's very expensive to get a patent. And then if you change one thing, then your patent is irrelevant. The virtual sets, everybody is doing virtual sets now, but they do it with a different kind of camera, or they do it, with a different system. So it's not just the idea of inventing something, but continuing with the legal system to keep your patent relevant in the future. So I did patent a few things, but basically it's useless for me. Never paid except that I got to do the work.
Not a big liquidity event, but still. Thank you. Great question. Next person. Is there a comment up there? No. Okay. Here. I think there's one right here.
I have a question about perspectives on technology, because in the movie you just played, I think the point of view in the movie is more like, I would say technophobic, because a lot of that main character presents a lot of using a lot of words like human extinction, or a lot of danger related to technology. But I think not all technologies are bad. Technologies, if they can be used in a positive manner, they can be really helpful. Like the police scanner thing that's shown in the video, to predict where the crime actually happened. I think that's when a technology like that is used correctly, that's actually very useful, because a lot of large cities like San Francisco are not safe. And is Berkeley safe? No. Are people willing to walk outside alone at 2 a.m.? No, they're probably get robbed. And that's not something we like, right? How to make cities safer. And if we just took away these technology and never used them anymore, are our cities going to get safer? And are our cities going to get any safer? No, probably not. And I think freedom is really important, and privacy of identities are really important. But what comes with freedom is responsibilities. And if some groups of people who commit these crimes are not going to perform the responsibilities that come with the freedom, it's not bad for us to just basically take their freedom away, because they're going to cause some harm. So what's your point of view on this?
Well, technology itself, is neutral. We invent things that we need, and it's really how they're used, and they're not used in a negative manner by everybody. But we should be aware when they are, and arm ourselves for protection. So it's really not the technology. The technology is very important as we continue to invent it.
And if I may also respond to this. I think one of the things, and maybe that actually reinforces what Lynn says, because the technology itself is not all portrayed as bad. She actually gives technology the voice, right? One of the things that we haven't spoken about, but it's really the strategy of embodiment that you use throughout your work. In your work, technology features as an embodied thing, right? And you're giving it a voice. And that voice recounts sort of like its genesis, its experience, its deployment. And while there's, of course, criticism built into that, because unfortunately, some of these technologies have been deployed without the necessarily ethical frameworks in place that could prevent some form of societal abuse. And I don't think anybody's saying that they were deployed in that way intentionally, but that there may be some unintended consequences that are harmful to certain people. And I think that's the part that's maybe missing in what you've just presented, is that the technology itself is not portrayed as bad. It's just it's giving a rendition, so to speak, through giving voice of an experience of it that is potentially bad. So it's a perspective on it rather than it.
Okay, great. I think we have a question from Greg and then a question here.
Thanks. Yeah, I remember seeing Lorna many years ago in a gallery, but it was glitching, and the gallery attendant said, "Oh, we have to replace the batteries, come back tomorrow." And actually, while it was glitching, it was still very beautiful. And I just wanted to ask you about the glitch aesthetic in some of the work, where you actually leave things, the seams between things open. And I'm looking at the picture that's up there with dotted lines and, some in-between state between the makeup being there and not being there. And oftentimes when technology becomes fully mature, those in-between states, the glitches disappear. And to me, that actually collapses technology into something that's much harder to interpret and to perceive. So can you say something on the subject of glitching and how we could keep the glitches alive?
Yeah, I adore the glitch. I live by glitches, and I preserve them. I've been told to make them more perfect, make them faster, but really it's true to the time that they're made, and I think that you have to pay attention to that, to not have something that you make in 1978 look like it was made in 2014, and really respect that. So that's part of the language of the time.
Thank you.
A lot of the predictive policing and other similar algorithms are extremely self-reinforcing in the patterns that they notice and then generate about the world, to the point where they stop predicting and start just recreating. Is there a very, how do people believe that these things work when they so visibly prescribe rather than describe the events that they're being asked to see?
Yeah, I think it's really tricky. It's a good question because when does that become an infection rather than a critique? And I think, again, it's just a point of awareness of what our possibilities are and what this is really doing, and what the changes will then mean in their broader ramifications. So I guess it's all about truly being aware of what's going on.
And that's exactly what Shadow Stalker is all about, which is the piece that was in Uncanny Valley. You saw elements of it that were integrated into Logic Paralyzes the Heart.
I'm sure you describe it a little bit more too.
Sure.
The way that the people would interact with it. 'Cause it
Yeah,
really is on point.
but I think the most important thing that one can do, and certainly what an artist can do, is precisely to put that question out there. because you're not the only one having that question. And what Lynn does with that work is precisely putting it out there. But yeah, so the way the installation operated was that you would walk into the room, and Lynn did touch upon it, but you would be invited to put your email address into an interface, and that would then pull up all the information that is available you online, sort of just from the input of your email address. And that would pop up on your screen. And if you haven't done it, it's quite eerie just to sort of see how this digital statistical shadow of yourself just suddenly sort of appears. And then that information was projected into a shadow that was on the opposite side of the gallery. It was projected into literally the outline of a figure that was rendered as a shadow, so that you could actually experience it in this, again, embodied form, right? Which is something that we as
data
humans,
self or something,
exactly, tend to respond to most viscerally. And as you had that experience, the film, which was the third element of the installation, was playing on the far wall, and it was an extended version of the bit that you saw here with Tessa Thompson, but that just dove deeper into exactly those mechanisms and how the predictive mechanisms become contingent, and self-reinforcing.
And eerily productive.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Is there a last question from the audience? Oh yeah, up there. Actually, one here and one up there. Could we get a microphone to both? Thank you so much. Okay, in the back of the room first.
Hi. So I just kind of had a question on the film. You kind of had a segment on the end where you said something about how we should arm ourselves better for the future, or don't make the mistakes of the past or something. And I think I and a lot of other people see the new AI where ChatGPT is able to write an 1,000-word essay really quickly, really easily, and a lot of easy jobs burger flipper will probably be replaced by AI in the coming future. So I just wanted to hear your outlook on that. Do you see that as a good thing or a bad thing, the removal of a lot of physical labor jobs and things like that?
I can't see mind flipping a burger, but it often flips the truth. And in the 1,000-word essay, how much of it is credible? And how do we know whether it is or not? I think that we're offering the same fears now as we did when Word came out. They said, there won't be libraries, we won't have books. When the internet happened, I think anytime there's anything new that comes out, everybody's afraid, rather than looking at the possibilities of enhancement.
That was actually a perfect question to lead into my comment. And first of all, thank you for so much inspiring content in so many different ways in such a short period of time. When the ChatGPT came out as an instructor, I immediately tried it out. And first of all, it's very easy to detect as an instructor when your students are using ChatGPT. It's crystal clear. Second, as we all know, I think, who have tested it, it gives many answers. If you ask the same question 10 times, it gives you 10 different answers, some with shades of correctness and often completely wrong, but sounding remarkably confident in that process. So one, I'm recommending my students look at how the ideas are being organized as a tool to improve their composition, also as a tool to fact check and embrace it to some degree as a way to build themselves as researchers. Third, and this is really what I was going to say, but then this comment kind of triggered this transition. Is it possible that as these tools continue to take over certain processes of, say, research or composition, that what makes us most human that we're not even clear about can surface. I mean, I think that's an exciting implication, and you kind of hinted at that. So I guess it's mostly a comment, and do you share that?
Do you think there are some roboticists who hate this fear, the fear dystopic thing, who say, no, exactly that they'll take, that potentially what can't be reproduced is the thing that we start to cherish, or no? Or is that too precious about humanness?
Yeah, I don't think there's an answer, an easy answer to this, but I think it might enhance our confidence as humans to know that we're the editors and the transcribers of whatever advances and really shortcuts we can get from this enabled search engine.
I love that thought, that at the very least, that we are the editors. Maybe also we're the entities on the planet that hold accountability and responsibility then too. And it is definitely sometimes, and perhaps too often, but wonderfully on the shoulders of artists to help provoke such questions and reflections. And Lynn Hershman Leeson is at the forefront of doing all of that posing and questioning and reflecting. And help me thank her and Claudia for such an incredible content-filled afternoon. Thank you.